Sergeant Thomas Bradley had served with the Queen's Guard for 8 years. His dedication to duty matched only by his love for the small Yorkshire village where he had grown up. Every weekend, he would drive the 3 hours north from London to visit his elderly parents, who still lived in the same stone cottage where they had raised him and his 3 siblings. The village of Millbrook had existed for over 400 years. Its narrow streets lined with cottages that had housed generations of farming families. The local church dated back to medieval times, and the village green had been the center of community life since before anyone could remember. For Thomas, returning home each weekend was like stepping back into a simpler, more peaceful world. His parents, Robert and Mary Bradley, had operated the village's only general store for 35 years, serving not just as shopkeepers, but as informal community leaders, who knew every family's history and helped neighbors through difficult times. The store was more than a business. It was the heart of village social life, where people gathered to share news, seek advice, and maintain the connections that held their small community together. Everything began to change when Megacorp Industries announced plans to build a massive chemical processing plant just outside Millbrook's boundaries. The multinational corporation, worth billions of pounds and operating in 17 countries, promised jobs and economic development for the rural area that had struggled financially for decades. Thomas first learned about the proposed plant during one of his weekend visits home, when his father mentioned receiving official notices about property assessments and environmental impact studies. The elderly man seemed confused by the legal language and corporate procedures, trusting that such a large company must have the community's best interests in mind. "They say it'll bring prosperity to the area," Robert told his son while they worked together in the store's stockroom. "The village council seems excited about the tax revenue and employment opportunities. Perhaps it's exactly what Millbrook needs to survive into the future." However, Thomas's military training had taught him to analyze situations carefully and question information that seemed too good to be true. When he reviewed the documents his parents had received, he noticed several concerning details that the village council appeared to have overlooked or dismissed. The proposed plant would process industrial chemicals used in manufacturing plastics and synthetic materials with waste products that required careful environmental management. While Megacorp's promotional materials emphasized safety measures and economic benefits, the technical specifications revealed potential risks that could affect the entire region's air and water quality. Most troubling to Thomas was the discovery that similar Megacorp facilities in other countries had been linked to environmental contamination and health problems in nearby communities. A quick internet search revealed lawsuits, regulatory violations, and cover-up attempts that painted a very different picture from the company's polished public relations campaign, the village council meeting where residents could voice their opinions about the proposed plant was scheduled for the following month. But Thomas realized that most villagers lacked the technical knowledge to understand the real implications of what they were being asked to approve. The information provided by Megacorp was deliberately complex and misleading. Designed to confuse rather than inform, Thomas spent his evenings researching environmental law, corporate responsibility, regulations, and the specific chemicals that would be processed at the proposed facility. His military background had given him research skills and attention to detail that proved invaluable as he began to understand the full scope of potential problems. The more he learned, the more concerned he became about his hometown's future. The proposed plant would irreversibly change Millbrook's character, while potentially endangering the health and safety of everyone he had grown up with, including his aging parents, who had no intention of leaving the only home they had ever known. His mother noticed his growing preoccupation during their Sunday dinner together, asking what was troubling him so deeply that he barely touched her famous roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. Thomas struggled to explain his concerns without frightening her. But Mary Bradley had raised 4 children and recognized worry when she saw it. "Thomas, dear," she said gently, "you've always been the one to spot problems before anyone else. If you're concerned about this chemical plant, then perhaps the rest of us should be paying closer attention as well." That conversation marked the beginning of Thomas's decision to take action against Megacorp Industries. Even though he understood that a single Royal Guard sergeant had virtually no chance of stopping a multinational corporation with unlimited legal resources, and political connections. His sense of duty to his community was stronger than his fear of impossible odds. The following week, Thomas used his leave time to attend the village council meeting where megacorp representatives would present their final proposal for community approval. He arrived in civilian clothes, but with a folder containing all the research he had compiled about the company's environmental record and the potential risks of their planned facility. The corporate presentation was slick and professional, delivered by executives in expensive suits who spoke confidently about economic benefits while glossing over environmental concerns. They had charts showing projected job creation and tax revenues, but nothing about air quality monitoring or groundwater protection measures. Thomas sat quietly through most of the presentation, taking notes and waiting for the appropriate moment to raise his concerns. Round him, his neighbors and childhood friends listened with the trust of people who had never had reason to doubt what authority figures told them about their own best interests. Asterisk. When the village council opened the floor for questions and comments, Thomas stood up slowly, his folder of research in hand and his heart pounding with nervous energy. He had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, but speaking against a powerful corporation in front of his entire community felt more intimidating than any military operation. "My name is Thomas Bradley," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I grew up in this village, and my family has lived here for 4 generations. I have some serious concerns about this proposed chemical plant that I believe everyone should consider before making a decision." The megacorp executives exchanged glances, clearly not expecting organized opposition from what they had assumed would be a routine community approval process. Their confident demeanor shifted slightly as they realized this might not be the simple formality they had anticipated. Thomas presented his research methodically, explaining in plain English what the technical documents really meant for Millbrooks: air quality, water supply, and long-term environmental health. He showed photographs of similar megacorp facilities in other countries where environmental damage had occurred. Despite initial promises of safety and responsibility, in Romania, groundwater contamination from a megacorp plant affected 3 villages and required a government cleanup costing millions of pounds, Thomas explained, holding up documentation. In Malaysia, air quality violations led to increased respiratory illness rates among children living within 5 miles of their facility. The room grew quiet as villagers began to understand the potential consequences that the corporate presentation had carefully avoided mentioning. Martha Wilson, the village school headmistress, asked pointed questions about how chemical emissions might affect the children she taught every day. The megacorp representatives responded with carefully prepared talking points about improved safety measures and regulatory compliance. But their answers seemed evasive when compared to Thomas's specific examples of past problems. The contrast between corporate spin and documented facts was becoming obvious to everyone present. Dr. James Hartwell, the village's only physician, requested more information about the health impacts Thomas had mentioned, particularly regarding respiratory and neurological effects from long-term chemical exposure. His medical expertise lent additional credibility to the concerns being raised. Thomas could see that his presentation was having an impact, but he also noticed several village council members looking uncomfortable with the direction the meeting was taking. Some of them had clearly already made commitments to support the project, possibly influenced by promises of personal benefits or political pressure. The lead megacorp executive, a polished man named Richard Sterling, attempted to regain control of the narrative by questioning Thomas's qualifications to interpret technical environmental data. "With all due respect, Mr. Bradley, you're a soldier, not a scientist. These issues require expert analysis that goes beyond internet research." Thomas had anticipated this line of attack and was prepared with his response. "You're absolutely right that I'm not a scientist, Mr. Sterling, but I am someone who has been trained to assess threats and protect people from danger. And everything I've learned about your company's environmental record suggests that this plant represents a significant threat to my community." The exchange between Thomas and Sterling became the focal point of the meeting, with other villagers listening intently as the 2 men debated environmental safety, corporate responsibility, and the true costs of economic development. Thomas's Military bearing and obvious sincerity contrasted sharply with Sterling's corporate polish and evasive answers. Eleanor Mitchell, an elderly woman whose family had farmed in the area for 6 generations, stood up to support Thomas's position. "I've lived through enough changes in this village to know that when someone promises something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. This young man has done his homework, and I think we should listen to what he's telling us." The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours, with villagers asking increasingly difficult questions that the megacorp representatives struggled to answer satisfactorily. Thomas had succeeded in shifting the conversation from blind acceptance to critical examination of the proposal and its potential consequences. When the village council called for a preliminary vote on whether to support the plant proposal, the result was much closer than anyone had expected. Instead of unanimous approval, the council voted 6-4 in favor, with several members requesting additional time to study the environmental concerns that Thomas had raised. After the meeting, Thomas was surrounded by neighbors thanking him for speaking up and asking where they could find more information about the issues he had discussed. His parents stood nearby, their faces showing pride in their son's courage and concern for their community's welfare. However, Thomas also noticed Sterling speaking quietly with several council members, his expression serious as he presumably discussed strategies for overcoming the resistance that had emerged during the meeting. The corporate executive was clearly not accustomed to having his company's proposals questioned so effectively as people filed out of the village hall. Thomas realized that his intervention had succeeded in raising awareness, but had probably also made him a target for corporate retaliation. Megacorp had billions of pounds at stake and would not allow a single Royal Guard sergeant to derail their carefully planned expansion into the British market. Within a week of the village meeting, Thomas discovered that Megacorp was not going to accept his challenge passively. The corporation's legal department had begun investigating his background, looking for any information that could be used to discredit his opposition to their project or undermine his credibility with the Millbrook community. A phone call from his commanding officer at the Queen's Guard informed Thomas that complaints had been filed questioning whether his political activities were appropriate for someone in his military position. The complaints suggested that he was using his uniform's prestige to influence civilian political processes, potentially violating regulations about military personnel engaging in partisan activities. Thomas knew that the charges were technically baseless, as he had carefully kept his environmental advocacy separate from his military duties and had never appeared in uniform at any village meetings. However, he also understood that even unfounded allegations could damage his career, potentially lead to disciplinary action that would silence his opposition to the plant. The pressure campaign escalated when Thomas's parents received an unexpected visit from a building inspector who claimed to have received complaints about their store's compliance with updated commercial safety regulations. The inspection revealed several minor violations that had never been enforced before, resulting in fines and mandatory improvements that would cost thousands of pounds. Mary Bradley was devastated by the inspector's report, not understanding why. Their store was suddenly being targeted for problems that had existed for years without any official concern. "Thomas," she said tearfully, "I can't help wondering if this has something to do with your speech at the village meeting. We've never had trouble with inspectors before." Similar harassment began affecting other villagers who had spoken in support of Thomas's position at the council meeting. Dr. Hartwell received a surprise audit of his medical practice, while Martha Wilson faced questions about her teaching qualifications that required extensive documentation to resolve. The pattern was too obvious to be coincidental. Thomas realized that Megacorp was using classic corporate intimidation tactics, applying pressure to community leaders who might oppose their project while making it clear that resistance would result in personal consequences. The strategy was designed to isolate him from potential allies and demonstrate the futility of fighting against corporate power. However, the intimidation campaign had an unexpected effect on some villagers who began to see Megacorp's actions as confirmation that Thomas's concerns about corporate behavior were justified. If the company was willing to harass a village doctor and an elderly shopkeeper, what would they do once their chemical plant was operational and generating profits? Eleanor Mitchell organized a secret meeting at her farmhouse, inviting everyone who had been targeted by the harassment campaign, along with other villagers who were growing suspicious of Megacorp's aggressive tactics. The group decided to form an unofficial resistance organization that could coordinate opposition to the plant while protecting individual members from retaliation. Thomas found himself reluctantly becoming the leader of this grassroots movement. His military training in strategy and tactics proving valuable for organizing effective opposition to a much larger and better-funded adversary. He began teaching his neighbors about information warfare, legal rights, media relations. The group's first major action was to contact environmental organizations and investigative journalists who might be interested in exposing Megacorp's international record of environmental violations and community intimidation. Thomas's research had provided an excellent foundation for media stories that could generate negative publicity for the corporation. Within a month, articles about Megacorp's environmental problems began appearing in regional newspapers and online publications, drawing attention to the company's pattern of promising safety while delivering pollution and health problems to communities around the world. The negative coverage was exactly what the corporation had hoped to avoid. Sterling, the Megacorp executive, requested a private meeting with Thomas, hoping to negotiate some kind of compromise that would end the negative publicity and allow the plant construction to proceed. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a coffee shop in a neighboring town where they could speak without attracting attention. Mr. Bradley, Sterling began, "You're fighting a battle you cannot win. Megacorp has resources and political connections that a village store owner's son couldn't possibly match. Why not accept the inevitable and work with us to ensure the best possible outcome for your community?" Thomas listened calmly to Sterling's mixture of threats and inducements, including hints about possible employment opportunities for him or his family members if he would stop opposing the plant. The corporate executive seemed genuinely puzzled by Thomas's refusal to be bought off or intimidated into submission. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas replied, "you seem to think this is about money or personal advancement. I took an oath to serve and protect, and that includes protecting my community from threats. Your company's record suggests that this plant would be a threat regardless of how much profit it might generate." The meeting ended without agreement, but Thomas could see that. Sterling was frustrated by his inability to resolve the situation through normal corporate methods. The executive had probably never encountered someone who couldn't be influenced by either rewards or punishment, and he clearly didn't understand what motivated Thomas's continued resistance. As Thomas drove back to Millbrook after the meeting, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. Megacorp would escalate their tactics, and he would need to find ways to protect his community while maintaining his own military career and family relationships. The stakes were rising, and the outcome was far from certain. The environmental story that Thomas had helped expose caught the attention of Rebecca Chen, an investigative journalist for The Guardian who specialized in corporate environmental crimes. She contacted Thomas through secure channels, expressing interest in conducting a deeper investigation into Megacorp's international operations and their proposed British expansion. Rebecca's research skills and media connections proved to be exactly what Thomas's grassroots movement needed to level the playing field against corporate power. She had access to government databases, international regulatory records, and a network of sources within environmental organizations who could provide additional evidence of Megacorp's problematic history, working together. Uncovered documents showing that Megacorp had deliberately concealed environmental test results from several international projects, including data that revealed groundwater contamination levels far exceeding legal limits. The company had used legal technicalities and political influence to avoid cleanup responsibilities in multiple countries. The investigation revealed a pattern of corporate behavior that extended far beyond environmental issues, including bribery of local officials, manipulation of environmental impact studies, and systematic intimidation of community leaders who opposed their projects. Megacorp's business model appeared to rely on exploiting regulatory weaknesses and overwhelming local opposition through superior resources. Rebecca's first major article appeared on The Guardian's front page with the headline, "Chemical Giants Trail of environmental destruction leads to British expansion. The story included photographs of contaminated communities, quotes from affected residents, and internal corporate documents that contradicted Megacorp's public statements about safety and responsibility. The article generated immediate international attention, with environmental groups, government regulators, and other journalists beginning their own investigations into Megacorp's activities. The corporation's stock price dropped significantly as investors realized the potential legal and financial liabilities associated with the company's environmental record. Thomas received a call from a parliamentary committee investigating environmental crimes, requesting his testimony about Megacorp's intimidation tactics against Millbrook residents. His military background and careful documentation of the harassment campaign made him an ideal witness to illustrate how corporations used pressure tactics against ordinary citizens. However, Megacorp's response to the negative publicity was swift and aggressive, with their legal department filing defamation lawsuits against The Guardian, Rebecca Chen, and several of the environmental organizations that had criticized their operations. The corporation clearly intended to use their vast legal resources to silence opposition through expensive litigation. Thomas found himself named as a defendant in one of the lawsuits, with Megacorp claiming that his statements about their environmental record constituted false and damaging allegations that had cost the company millions of pounds and lost business opportunities. The legal papers arrived at his military barracks, creating additional complications for his service career. His commanding officer called him in for a serious discussion about the implications of being involved in civilian litigation while serving with the Queen's Guard. While the officer acknowledged that Thomas had acted within his rights as a private citizen, the high-profile nature of the case was creating unwanted attention for the military organization. "Bradley," the colonel said with obvious concern, "I admire your principles, and I believe you're fighting for the right cause. But you need to understand that this situation could end your military career if it continues to escalate." Prepared for that possibility? Thomas had already considered the potential consequences and had decided that protecting his community was worth personal sacrifice, even if it meant leaving the military career he loved. His parents had raised him to stand up for what was right, regardless of personal costs, and he couldn't abandon that principle now. The legal battle attracted support from unexpected sources, including retired military officers who admired Thomas's courage and environmental lawyers who offered pro bono assistance for his defense. The case was becoming a symbol of individual citizens standing up to corporate power. Generating sympathy and support from people who had never heard of Millbrook, Eleanor Mitchell organized a legal defense fund for Thomas. With contributions coming from villagers, environmental activists, and supporters around the world who had read about the case in international media coverage, the fund grew large enough to hire experienced environmental lawyers who could match Megacorp's legal firepower. The parliamentary committee hearing where Thomas testified was covered by major news networks, giving him a platform to present his case to a national audience. His military bearing and obvious sincerity made him an effective spokesman for the anti-corporate movement. Generating additional public support for his position, during his testimony, Thomas presented evidence of the harassment campaign against Millbrook residents, the environmental problems at other Megacorp facilities, and the deliberate deception in the company's safety claims. His presentation was calm, factual, and devastating to the corporation's public image. The committee members, representing all major political parties, expressed outrage at the evidence of corporate intimidation and environmental cover-ups that Thomas presented. Several committee members promised legislative action to strengthen environmental protections and prevent similar corporate abuses in the future. Megacorp's representatives testified after Thomas, but their evasive answers and obvious discomfort under questioning created a stark contrast with his straightforward presentation. The corporation's credibility was clearly damaged, and their stock price continued to decline as investors lost confidence in the company's management. As Thomas left the parliamentary building after his testimony, he was surrounded by reporters and supporters who treated him like a hero for standing up to corporate power. However, he remained focused on the ultimate goal of protecting Millbrook and knew that the real battle was still ahead. The turning point in Thomas's battle against Megacorp came from an unexpected source when Dr. Patricia Morrison, former company scientist, contacted Rebecca Chen with insider information about the proposed Millbrook facility. Dr. Morrison had worked for Megacorp's Environmental Safety Division before being fired for raising concerns about inadequate safety measures and falsified ENVIRONMENTAL reports. Dr. Morrison revealed that internal company studies had identified serious geological problems at the Millbrook site that made it unsuitable for chemical processing operations. The underlying rock formations contained natural fractures that could allow chemical contamination to spread directly into the regional groundwater system, potentially affecting drinking water supplies for hundreds of thousands of people. Whistleblower provided Rebecca with copies of internal emails, geological surveys, and safety assessments that Megacorp had deliberately concealed from British regulators and the Millbrook community. The documents showed that company executives knew about the environmental risks, but had decided to proceed with the project anyway, hoping to hide the problems until after construction was completed. Thomas worked with Rebecca and Dr. Morrison to verify the scientific information and understand its implications for the legal case against Megacorp. The insider evidence was exactly what they needed to prove that the corporation had engaged in deliberate fraud and environmental endangerment, rather than simple negligence or oversight. The revelation of the geological problems created a cascade of additional investigations, with government environmental agencies launching official inquiries into Megacorp's permit applications and safety claims. The company's credibility with regulators was completely destroyed as the extent of their deception became clear. European Union environmental authorities opened their own investigation into Megacorp's operations across multiple countries, potentially exposing the corporation to massive fines and criminal charges for violating international environmental protection treaties. The British case had triggered a much larger examination of corporate behavior. Thomas received an unexpected phone call from the Prime Minister's office, requesting a private meeting to discuss the implications of the Megacorp case for British environmental policy and corporate regulation. The Royal Guard sergeant found himself advising government leaders about legislative reforms needed to prevent similar corporate abuses. The meeting with government officials was surreal for Thomas, who had begun his opposition to Megacorp simply by standing up at a village council meeting. Now he was being consulted about national environmental policy by some of the most powerful people in Britain, all because he had refused to let a corporation intimidate his community. Megacorp's legal strategy began falling apart as courts dismissed several of their defamation lawsuits due to the overwhelming evidence of corporate wrongdoing that had emerged from the various investigations. The company's attempt to silence opposition through litigation had backfired spectacularly, generating even more negative publicity and legal liability. The corporation's board of directors faced increasing pressure from shareholders who were angry about the massive financial losses resulting from the environmental scandal. Stock analysts predicted that Megacorp might face bankruptcy if the legal and regulatory consequences continued to escalate at their current rate. Sterling, the executive who had tried to intimidate Thomas, was fired by Megacorp's board as a scapegoat for the public relations disaster. However, Thomas felt no satisfaction from his former opponent's downfall. Understanding that Sterling had simply been following corporate policies that prioritized profits over environmental and community safety, the village of Millbrook had become internationally famous as the small community that had successfully challenged a multinational corporation, with tour buses bringing visitors who wanted to see where the environmental battle had begun. Thomas's parents' general store became an unofficial tourist attraction, generating more business than they had seen in decades. Environmental organizations around the world began using Thomas's story as an example of how individual citizens could successfully oppose corporate power through persistence, careful research, and strategic media engagement. His case was being taught in university courses about environmental activism and corporate accountability. The legal defense fund that Eleanor Mitchell had organized had grown to over £2 million, with contributions coming from supporters in more than 40 countries who saw Thomas as a symbol of resistance against corporate environmental crimes. The fund's success demonstrated the global nature of environmental concerns, and corporate accountability issues. Thomas's military career had survived the controversy, with his superiors ultimately deciding that his environmental activism reflected, well, on the values and integrity expected from members of the Queen's Guard. His courage in standing up to corporate intimidation was seen as consistent with military principles of protecting civilians from threats. The parliamentary committee that had heard Thomas's testimony issued a comprehensive report recommending major reforms to environmental regulation and corporate oversight, with many of the proposed changes directly inspired by lessons learned from the Megacorp case. The legislative impact of his activism would extend far beyond protecting Marol. As the various investigations and legal proceedings continued, Thomas began receiving speaking invitations from environmental groups, universities, and community organizations around the world. His story had become an inspiration for other grassroots movements challenging corporate power and environmental destruction. However, Thomas remained focused on his original goal of protecting his hometown, knowing that the ultimate success of his campaign would be measured not by international recognition or legislative reforms, but by whether the people of Millbrook could continue living safely in the community their families had called home for generations. 2 years after Thomas first stood up at the village council meeting, Megacorp Industries officially announced the cancellation of their Millbrook chemical processing plant, citing regulatory complications and community concerns in their press release. The victory was complete, but the corporation's euphemistic language couldn't hide the reality that a Royal Guard sergeant had defeated one of the world's largest multinational companies. The announcement came during a packed village council meeting where Thomas was presenting an update on the ongoing legal proceedings. The room erupted in applause and celebration as villagers realized that their community had been permanently saved from the threat of industrial contamination and environmental destruction. Thomas's parents wept with joy and pride as their neighbors surrounded their son with congratulations and expressions of gratitude that would continue for years to come. Mary Bradley told reporters that she had always known her boy would do something important with his life, but she had never imagined it would save their entire village from corporate exploitation. The legal settlements that followed were unprecedented in their scope and financial impact, with Megacorp agreeing to pay millions of pounds in damages to communities around the world that had been affected by their environmental crimes. Dr. Morrison's whistleblower evidence had exposed decades of corporate wrongdoing that resulted in criminal charges against several company executives. Thomas established the Millbrook Environmental Foundation using his portion of the legal settlement, creating an organization dedicated to helping other small communities defend themselves against corporate environmental threats. The foundation provided legal assistance, scientific expertise, and media support for grassroots environmental movements worldwide. Rebecca Chen won multiple journalism awards for her investigative reporting on the Megacorp case, but she consistently credited Thomas with providing the courage and community connections that made the story possible. Their partnership had demonstrated how traditional journalism and grassroots activism could work together to hold corporations accountable. Eleanor Mitchell was elected to the village council as its first female chairwoman, running on a platform of environmental protection and community independence that reflected the values Thomas had championed. Under her leadership, Millbrook became a model for sustainable rural development that attracted visitors and researchers from around the world. The Queen herself honored Thomas with a personal commendation recognizing his service to environmental protection and community welfare, noting that his actions reflected the highest values of military service and British citizenship. The ceremony at Buckingham Palace was attended by his parents, who barely contained their pride as their son received royal recognition. Thomas's military career flourished after the Megacorp victory, with his superiors recognizing that his environmental activism had enhanced rather than damaged the reputation of the Queen's Guard. He was promoted to warrant officer and given special responsibilities for community outreach and environmental education programs. The village of Millbrook established an annual Thomas Bradley Environmental Protection Day, celebrating not just his individual victory, but the power of ordinary citizens to challenge corporate power when they have courage, persistence, and community support. The festival attracted environmental activists and tourists from around the world. Dr. Morrison used her insider knowledge of corporate environmental crimes to establish a consulting firm that helped government agencies detect and prevent environmental fraud. Her work, inspired by Thomas's courage in challenging megacorp, led to the exposure and prevention of numerous other corporate environmental scandals. The legislative reforms recommended by the Parliamentary Committee were enacted into law, creating stronger environmental protections and corporate accountability, measures that prevented other communities from facing the threats that Millbrook had overcome. Thomas's testimony had contributed to systemic changes that protected millions of people. International environmental law schools began teaching the Millbrook model as an example of how grassroots environmental movements could successfully challenge multinational corporations through strategic use of media, legal systems, and community organizing. Thomas's victory had become a template for environmental activism worldwide. Thomas continued his weekend visits to Millbrook. Now he often found groups of visitors waiting to meet the royal guard who had defeated megacorp industries. He remained humble about his role in the victory, consistently emphasizing that the success had been achieved through community cooperation rather than individual heroism. His parents' general store had become a pilgrimage site for environmental activists, with people from around the world stopping to meet the elderly couple whose son had inspired global changes in corporate accountability. Robert and Mary Bradley graciously welcomed visitors, while continuing to serve their local community as they had for decades. The story of Thomas's battle against megacorp was adapted into books, documentaries, and educational materials that inspired new generations of environmental activists. However, he remained focused on his military duties and family relationships, understanding that the real victory was not fame or recognition, but the preservation of his community's safety and independence. As Thomas stood guard at Buckingham Palace, tourists often recognized him as the environmental hero who had challenged corporate power and won. He would smile politely but remain focused on his ceremonial duties, knowing that the most important battle of his life had been fought not in London or foreign battlefields, but in defense of the Yorkshire village where his heart would always remain. The triumph over megacorp had proven that individual courage, community solidarity, and persistent dedication to truth could overcome even the most powerful corporate interests. Thomas Bradley's victory belonged not just to Millbrook, but to everyone who believed that ordinary people could still make extraordinary differences in an increasingly corporate world.